If you would, open up to Matthew chapter 2. Matthew chapter 2. If you kind of remember from chapter 1 how oftentimes Matthew goes through, like chapter 1, verse 1, the record of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah. Then you look down at verse 16. It says, Jacob was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, by whom Jesus was born, who is called the Messiah. Verse 17, so all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations, from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the deportation of Babylon to the Messiah, 14 generations. Verse 18 opens up. Now the birth of Jesus Christ, another name for Messiah, was as follows. And you just see time and time again trying to get the readers of Matthew to grasp, this is not just about any old Jew. This is about the Christ. This is about the Messiah, the anointed one. Knowing that Jesus was anointed with the Spirit, anointed with blood in terms of as he was dying, and also in terms of anointed with sin, and also anointed with life in terms of his resurrection. You think of all these things culminating together from all these prophecies of the Old Testament. And so whenever you get here to chapter 2 and it opens up, I want you to notice the very first verse and pay close attention, because there's some things that we're going to see today that may not be the same as what people say every holiday season. So be careful, keep your ears alert and your eyes open. Chapter 2 opens up this way. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, and we'll leave a little cliffhanger here, notice what's in place. Just think about the timing of the chronology of it. At what point is he going to tell this next story? It's like after Jesus is already born. He's already been born in Bethlehem. He says, and once again, to point out Bethlehem specifically because of a prophecy he's about to bring up, actually a few of them. But to go, okay, here's the timing. Those last few verses in chapter 1, okay, this is the situation so that Mary was kept a virgin until she gave birth to this son. And it's as if you would expect, well, where's the actual events of Jesus' birth from the end of chapter 1 to the beginning of chapter 2? And Matthew doesn't go into all those details that you can easily get over in Luke chapter 2. So you realize the only aspect in verse 25 at the end of chapter 1 is, but kept her a virgin until she gave birth to a son, and he called his name Jesus. And that was the extent of what Matthew was going to share. Now, we know we can go read more in Luke, but then chapter 2 opens up. Now you start to get in kind of the following details of going, all right, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, and of course, Bethlehem is only about 5 or 6 miles south of Jerusalem. So he says, in the days of Herod the king, and of course, this is talking about Herod the Great. Herod was born sometime around like 72 BC, and it's talked about how that he died at around 4 BC, which is kind of an interesting thing. Don't get too caught up whenever you think about, people typically think, oh, Jesus must have been born at 0 BC. Well, these are things they tried to go back and piece together with kind of some sketchy history at the time. And so Jesus is actually born around 4 BC, which is kind of ironic, isn't it? To think of the chronologies about before. He died before himself? How does that work? Or he's born before himself? And you realize, if you had to dig through the annals of history trying to find things hundreds and hundreds of years before, you can understand why the dating that man's come up with is going to be a little off. So be thoughtful. Don't be critical. So here they are. And so the days of Herod the Great, and then it says, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem. Now notice, where do they come? Yeah, and well, kind of pay close attention here. He says, after Jesus is born in Bethlehem of Judea, and it doesn't say how long after Jesus' birth at this point. He says, men from the east, he says, arrived, these magi, which magi just is about these men who specialized in following things of the stars, of the celestial bodies. If you think about Genesis 1, it specifically talks about in verse 14 that the lights in the expanse of the heavens would be used for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. And so at some point, these people had maybe heard of that or made up their own kind of things, and to go, whatever it was, God put it in their language. Whatever they were understanding and grasping, whatever he set up, it was something where they went, oh, and you'll see that here in a second. But to go, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem. Notice, they don't go to where? They don't go to Bethlehem. They come to Jerusalem. And this is where we're going to start to unravel this age-old story. Verse 2, and this is what they have to say when they get there. He says, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." What do they already know? He's the Messiah. I mean, they don't use that term necessarily, but where is he who has been born? They already recognize he has already been born in whatever way they know that. And I can't explain that part. But to go, they don't say who will be born. They say who has been born. So you understand why verse 1 started the way it did. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem, well, these Magi show up in Jerusalem, and they're wondering, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? Now, you think of just that phrase, King of the Jews. Where do you know you're going to see that phrase again? Yeah, on the cross. I mean, over in Matthew 27:37, I think. To go, this is Jesus, the King of the Jews. And to go, it's for this very reason that he's going to be crucified. Now, here we are just at the very beginnings after he's born, and the Magi show up, and this is their question, where is he? We know he's been born. We know he's the King of the Jews. He says, and here's how they know it. He says, "For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." Now, from the east, they're not talking about just down the street. I mean, you're talking about there's time to travel from the east, maybe you might think in terms of the Orient, and going to travel across. So however much you want to guess that amount of time to be, I mean, you're not talking about days. And to go, here they are, and we saw his star in the east, and they came. They didn't just see it and go, well, I wonder what that means. In whatever way they were interpreting what was going on in the stars, God put it in their language so they could grasp, the King of the Jews is here, and he's born. And I'm not saying I understand all that, but at the same time, notice their purpose was not just to sightsee and to come. Notice what is their purpose. They wanted to worship him. And you think of those terms of going, we want to know where he is so that we can worship him. Now, notice the effect this has on those who hear. Verse 3. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Now, whenever you think in those terms about when Herod hears this, and notice what it specifically tells you about Herod. Herod the king. I mean, you hear about the King of the Jews is here. You want to know who wonders about that? The current king. Like, what's about to happen to me? And he had been there about 34 years, Herod the Great, had been he had taken control of Jerusalem about 34 years before this. So getting to hear that the king is here, you can understand why it uses this kind of terminology to say, he's troubled. And troubled can have more than one idea here. It's emotional distress. It can even be fear, or it can just be perplexity. But you can understand why all that would fit. Herod going, should I be looking over my shoulder? How's this going to turn out for me? Am I about to be removed? Am I about to die? this king of the Jews you're talking about, what kind of time frame should I be looking at? How old is this king? How long ago has this been? You'll see him secretly ask that question here in a little bit. But notice it's not just Herod that thinks that way. Who else? All of Jerusalem, whenever they hear, they're perplexed too. They're troubled, not in the same sense that Herod is, I'm sure, but going, what's all this mean? What's going on here? Now, as these things happen, if you notice their question initially, where is he? He says, we know he's a king, the king of the Jews. They say, we want to worship him. And certainly sets Herod off to be troubled, and all Jerusalem's really curious about this. And you think about, there's some things sometimes that you hear, just in general news, that whenever you read the headline or see something that's online, you go, what's going on here? What's this story? And that's the same kind of troubled and perplexity where they're at in all this. It's not as if everybody's going, oh, well, of course, this is the Messiah. He's come. No. You see these things unravel. Verse 4, gathering together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. Now, notice the connection that is being made. Oh, so here's Herod, and it's because it does say he, not them. It says, gathering together all the chief priests and the scribes of the people. I mean, all of them. All the chief priests, these would be, Levitical priests. He says, all the scribes, these are the men whose job it was to copy scripture of the Old Testament, to make copies that were 100% accurate. I mean, it's not as if you can make just a mistake or two and it still be okay. If you made a mistake, you had to go burn all your work and start all over again, because it had to be 100% accurate. So here's the scribes who are so familiar with Old Testament. Here's the chief priests, all of them gathered together, and Herod's big question is, where's the Messiah supposed to be born? Now, isn't it interesting that Herod's making some connections together with all this? He doesn't just say, where's the king of the Jews supposed to be born? Where's this anointed one, the Messiah? Now, let me give you a little background on Herod the Great. Herod the Great is not a bloodline Jew. He is someone whose grandfather kind of converted to Judaism. And so over time, there's some other things mixed in with his mother as well. His father is actually an Edomite, if you want to know about bloodline descendants. But as part of those things, he has kind of been indoctrinated with a lot of the Jewish things. But the Jews have real trouble with him because he's not a real Jew in their minds. So he knows enough, as some would say, to be trouble. But at the same time, and you can tell here from what you know is coming, it's not as if he's wholeheartedly in on these things. So whenever he inquires of them to say, where's the Messiah supposed to be born? Janet.
Is Herod appointed from the government of Rome?
Yes, from the Roman Empire. About 37 years before he dies, there's a battle where he comes in and kind of is given control over Jerusalem as a king or a governor. And so he's kind of appointed, but he still has to battle somebody else before it's really solely his. About 38 BC, something like that, plus or minus. So you can understand he is appointed by the Romans, and part of the reason they would choose him is because he's familiar with the Jews, but he's still kind of one of us. It's kind of sketchy, but you kind of see the idea. So here they are, and I want you to notice verse 5. They said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for this is what has been written by the prophet. Are they clueless? Not at all. And notice it doesn't say one of them said. This is something they knew. This is where the Messiah is going to be from. And so he says, in Bethlehem of Judea, as if to say, it's just like, 5 or 6 miles away from here is where the Messiah is going to be born. And can you imagine, I don't know if the Magi were actually part of this group, because verse 4 says they gathered together all the chief priests and the scribes. But to go, can you imagine whenever they hear that of going, oh, we're close. I mean, you think about something, you came however many hundreds, if not thousands of miles to come and see, and then to find out you're only 5 or 6 miles away from there. You think you'd get excited? Especially if your purpose is to worship this King of the Jews. You came all this way, and they didn't use GPS either. And they didn't have cars, and they didn't have anything that made it really handy and convenient. Maybe convenient for the time, but not in our mind. So here they are, and if you notice what it says, in Bethlehem of Judea, he says, for this is what has been written by the prophet. Now, I'll give you just this little nugget, and I think you can see how it applies. Bethlehem in the original language literally means house of war and bread. And bread. You can understand with Jesus coming to earth what this begins. It's not all pretty. It's like all of a sudden here's Jesus who's going to take on sin. It's like the war is underway. He is on earth. At the same time, he's going to offer something that no one else can offer. I mean, if you think in terms of the way Jesus talks about himself, he says, I am the true bread. I am the manna that came down from heaven. And so it's just kind of such a unique thing that God would choose Bethlehem for him to be born in, because of the prophecies that come from the Old Testament as well. Because notice here at the end of verse 5, he says, in Bethlehem of Judea, for this is what has been written by the prophet. Now, whenever you think about the prophet, you go, oh, they were thinking of somebody in particular. Now, a couple of things I want to point out to you before we get to what's at hand here. Look back at Numbers 24. Numbers 24. There's two reasons I want to turn here. One's for what we're dealing with right now, but I'm going to go ahead and give something away to save some time for where we're coming next. Numbers 24. Look down at verse 15. Remember, Balak is a wicked king, and he calls the prophet Balaam to come and make a prophecy against God's own people, which, Balaam was not going to do. But I want you to notice this prophecy that Balaam gives to Balak. And just notice a few of these details. Start in verse 15. He took up his discourse and said, the oracle of Balaam the son of Beor, and the oracle of the man whose eye is opened, the oracle of him who hears the words of God and knows the knowledge of the Most High, who sees the vision of the Almighty falling down, yet having his eyes uncovered. How's that for an introduction for a prophet and his prophecy? I'm telling you things that nobody else can tell you. He says, because God has uncovered my eyes. God is the one who has done this. Then, if you know, he says, the vision of the Almighty, the Most High, the words of God, man whose eyes opened, he says, eyes uncovered, verse 17. I see him, but not now. He says, I behold him, but not near. A star shall come forth from Jacob. A scepter shall rise from Israel, and shall crush through the forehead of Moab, and tear down all the sons of Sheth. Now, think about what Balaam's saying. I'm giving you this prophecy, and it's not dealing with the present. This is dealing with things that are far off in the future. And if you think about where we are in time, I mean, Jesus' coming is still about 1,500 years away at the giving of this prophecy. And God uses Balaam to tell about a star is going to come forth from Jacob. And you realize, oh, this is kind of interesting. Now, you think in reading through this, it's not as if Balak or Balaam are going, oh, this is all about Jesus, the Messiah, who's coming. But at the same time, I want you to see there are other places in the Old Testament that talk about these similar things. And once again, Genesis 1:14 talks about, hey, these lights in the expanses, he says they're not only for keeping track of seasons and days and years, they're also going to be for signs. And you realize, don't look into that too far. Don't think, well, we'll just start looking at the stars to get all of our answers. No, look to the Word of God. But you see how he's using it. And then you kind of notice what he brings up. And by the way, Balak is the king of Moab. So this is not good news for him. Also, I want you to look up at verse 8 in the same chapter. Well, maybe we should go a step back. You can notice another thing. Go back to verse 3. Here's the first discourse. He took up his discourse and said, the oracle of Balaam the son of Beor, and the oracle of the man whose eyes opened, the oracle of him who hears the words of God, who sees the vision of the Almighty falling down, yet having his eyes uncovered. Very similar introduction, right? How fair are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling, O Israel? Like valleys that stretch out, like gardens beside the river, like aloes planted by the Lord. But notice Lord's in all caps. So we're talking about covenant relationship, Jehovah God. Like cedars beside the waters, water will flow from his buckets, and his seed will be by many waters, and his king shall be higher than Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted. Now notice the next verse, verse 8. God brings him out of Egypt. If you've read ahead in chapter 2, you know where Jesus is going to be sent. He's going to be called out of Egypt. And since we're already in chapter 24, I just want you to realize these things are not just every once in a while mentioned. Because here they are, even these two in the same chapter. It says, he is for him like the horns of the wild ox. He will devour the nations who are his adversaries and will crush their bones in pieces and shatter them with his arrows. He couches, he lies down as a lion. He says, and as a lion, who dares rouse him? He says, you want to pick a fight with him? You're not wise. He says, blessed is everyone who blesses you, and cursed is everyone who curses you. And you realize, I just want you to see these things are kind of mingled through the Old Testament. But specifically, let's get to the prophet that they were talking about. Look at Micah chapter 5. If you find Jonah, just go next door. Look at Micah chapter 5. Specifically, if you look at verse 2, that's the quotation that's back in Matthew chapter 2. But I want you to notice a couple of verses before and after. Micah chapter 5, look at verse 1. Now muster yourselves in troops, daughter of troops. They have laid siege against us. With a rod they will smite the judge of Israel on the cheek. Now if you're thinking about prophecies about Jesus, when did that one come true? Yeah. If you remember, around the time of the trial, the soldiers gathered together and they beat him with a rod or with the staff that they used to mock him with as he's wearing the crown of thorns. And you notice, is Jesus not going to be the judge? I mean, and God shows that by his resurrection. Here's the one who's going to judge all the earth in righteousness. Talks about it in Acts. He says, with a rod they will smite the judge of Israel on the cheek. Verse 2. But as for you, Bethlehem Ephrath, too little to be among the clans of Judah. Little old tiny Bethlehem. And it gives another name in terms of Bethlehem Ephrathah. It's just a more specific name. And so he says, too little to be among the clans of Judah. From you one will go forth for me to be ruler in Israel. And by ruler, what does he mean? King. He says, his goings forth are from long ago, from the days of eternity. So where is this king coming from? from heaven. He's eternal, right? So this is not a Johnny-come-lately. I mean, this is the Word in the flesh, is the way John 1 would describe him. And to go eternal. Then, verse 3, therefore he will give them up until the time when she who is in labor has borne a child. Then the remainder of his brethren will return to the sons of Israel. Notice verse 4. You see other language that seems very applicable. And he will arise and shepherd his flock. What does Jesus even call himself in John 10? I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. He says, in the strength of the Lord. I mean, these are other times. Whenever Jesus comes out of the wilderness in Luke 4, after he's been tempted for 40 days and 40 nights, it talks about him coming out in the strength of the Lord, in the strength of the Spirit. And you realize another application to Jesus. He continues on. He says, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, and they will remain, because at that time he will be great to the ends of the earth. Where is his dominion after his resurrection? I mean, if you remember the words at the end of Matthew 28, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. There's his dominion. And that covers all of the nations, to the ends of the earth. Verse 5, just the rest of the sentence. He says, this one will be our peace. Now, you think of all that coming together in terms of where is the Messiah supposed to be born? And they said, Bethlehem. They knew that. And you can understand how they could put that together just from those 5 verses, let alone all the other things in the Old Testament that apply to similar things. So come back over to Matthew chapter 2. So whenever you read verse 6, which is the quotation of Micah 5:2, it says, and you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah. For out of you shall come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. He says, not only is he going to be the Messiah, not only is he going to be the ruler, not only is he going to be the shepherd, you realize he's coming out of little old Bethlehem. And if you kind of think about it, it's not as if Bethlehem was this. We think of Bethlehem a whole lot more highly than they did. Let's put it that way. For them, Bethlehem was kind of, I'm trying to think of a little old hamlet that's around this area that we go, oh yeah, I think I know where that is. I think I drove through there once. For them, Bethlehem, I mean, it did have this direct tie to David, which, as you already know from chapter 1, is very important. Being a descendant of David, being of the tribe of Judah. And remember, what took them down there, from what you know in Luke? I mean, the whole reason they go down to Bethlehem is because of a census, right? There's the census that's given. And so they have to go back down to where their homelands are and where their inheritance is. And so they go back down to Bethlehem. And I want you to think about the righteousness of Joseph and Mary. I mean, how many people go, you know what, I am like 8.5 months pregnant. Maybe it would be okay if we didn't go. Because that is like 90 miles away from here. And yet, they don't do that. They go, you know what, this is what we need to do. It doesn't matter the shape we're in. We're going to go do this. And you think, there's a reason God chose Joseph and Mary to be I'm going to call them the surrogate parents for his son, of going, you know what? They'll do my will. And in keeping my commands to honor those who are rulers over them, he says, they will do that. And because they do it, you see them fulfill prophecy. And realize it just comes down to things being that simple. Now, of course, you know, Jesus being born of Mary, the Virgin, you see those things together. And yet, here's what the chief priests and the scribes put in front. And it doesn't even make it sound like they had to go look it up and study it. It makes it sound like they just kind of knew that from heart. And you know, I'm not so sure I got Micah 5:2 memorized, just to let you know. But for them, apparently they just came right forward with it. Now notice verse 7. Then Herod secretly called the Magi and determined from them the exact time the star appeared. Now notice, Herod doesn't do this in front of everybody. He hears apparently what's going on here and goes, can we talk just a little bit just to ourselves? And notice, what does Herod want to know so desperately? Can you tell me exactly when this king got here? When this star arrived? He says, I want to know when this star appeared. Can you give me that time? And I'm sure for them, like anybody who's educated in something, you get asked a question, you go, well, you betcha we can tell you. And it's this many days, and I'm sure they gave him probably more than he wanted. But at the same time, he wanted to know this pretty bad. And you know the reason why, but we'll get to it here in a second. Karen.
It was the irony kind of makes me think Herod is believing the prophecy kind of thing. That's commemorate.
Right, and you think, here's where, like I said, he's got a Jewish upbringing in some ways, but he's not all in that. And to go, so he has trust in what these chief priests and scribes are saying. Then, notice next, verse 8. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child, and when you have found him, report to me so that I too may come and worship him. From whatever time frame they told Herod, what does Herod know about the time frame? Is this boy, is he now a man? He's still a child. And you realize too, where does he send them? You go down to Bethlehem. I mean, it's only 5 or 6 miles away, not too far. And for them, I mean, that's like a couple of hours of walking at the longest. So, and you can imagine how excited they would be to get there. I imagine they did it pretty quick. But he sends them to Bethlehem because that's where the Messiah, the king, is supposed to be born. He says, go search carefully for the child. When you have found him, report to me. He says, come back and tell me when you find him. Now he doesn't, if you notice, Herod doesn't go, okay, well, I'll go down with you. He says, you come back and you tell me when you found the child. He says, and what he gives as his reason is what? I want to worship him too. I'm just like you. Now, I'm not going to go down this road too far, but I mean, isn't that what you see some political people want to do? Of go, I'm just like you. I want to do the same thing you want to do. But to go, here's what he's putting forward. I want to worship him like you want to worship him. Now, is that a true statement? Not at all. Not at all. Because you know what's coming. Then, verse 9. After hearing the king, they went their way. And you go, they heard it and they were like, fantastic, we've been itching to go ever since we heard where it was. He says, and the star, no specifically it says the star, which they had seen in the east, went on before them until it came and stood over the place where the child was. Now, here's what's a little peculiar. Does it say they went to Bethlehem? It doesn't, does it? But what do most people call that star? The Star of Bethlehem. Now, I'm going to give you some details you can look up on your own in the Gospel of Luke. In Luke chapter 2, 8 days after Jesus is born, do you know where he is? He's in the temple. In what city? Jerusalem. 8 days later, he's there. 33 days after he's born, they have to offer a sacrifice. Whenever a mother gave birth to a son or a daughter, the sons were on the 33rd day, daughters were on the 66th day. They had to make an offering at the temple for that. Now, I do want you to go look at this one. Look over at Luke chapter 2. And I want you to notice something, verse 39. Luke chapter 2, verse 39. On day 33, they offer up the offering. And if you remember, if you go back and read the verses before here, they run into people who know who Jesus is, and they haven't told anybody. But you just imagine how odd that would be, of going, there's a woman, a prophetess by the name of Anna that they encounter, and boy, she's got a whole lot to say about who this boy is. And Simeon has something else to say about this is the Messiah. He says, he's going to take away the sins of Israel. And you go, man, how do these people know all this stuff? Now, they knew it because of what Mary had been told by Gabriel. But it's one thing when you know information and then somebody else tells you what you thought was a secret. And you go, that's interesting. How do you know that? But they knew because God had shared that with these two individuals in the temple. But after they had performed all these sacrifices, notice verse 39, when they had performed everything according to the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own city of Nazareth. Now Jesus is 33 days old, and whether on day 33 or 34, they take back up to go up to Nazareth. And if you realize this too, I mean, Nazareth's some 70 miles away. And so you realize, oh, they're going back. I mean, where were they staying in Bethlehem? They didn't even have a room in the inn, did they? They were out there in the stable or the shed or whatever it was, wherever they kept the animals, because that's why Jesus gets laid in a feeding trough, in a manger. And you go, it's one thing to be born there. It's another thing, is that where you would stay? I mean, if you had any other option as a mother, would you go, Joseph, we're right where we need to be? I mean, with everything else. Karen.
And it's funny that, in our both religious customs at Christmas time, they show the stable and Jesus is born in the shepherds. And the shepherds were there.
Yeah, the shepherds do come. If you read on in Luke 2, you'll see that.
The Magi were there, but in our quote religious, they always show the Magi there at the stable. They weren't there at the stable.
Right. So if you come back over here to Matthew chapter 2, you notice how the beginning of the chapter was after Jesus was born. It doesn't give you a time frame. Whenever Herod asks, when you find the child, come and report back to me, and you realize, oh, he doesn't say the baby. And you realize he just says child, which it does have a broad spectrum to the term, so don't let me lead you into something that's not necessarily there. But if notice the way it's talked about here in verse 9, Matthew 2, verse 9. After hearing the king, they went their way, and the star which they had seen in the east went on before them until it came and stood over the place where the child was. Now, think about that, where the child was, not where he was born. Now, this next one really puts the nail in it, verse 11. After coming into the house, notice, they're not out there where the animals are, right? And you can see how the time frame fits together with what we know from Luke 2. After they fulfilled those sacrifices in Jerusalem, they go back to Nazareth. And it took time. Remember, the Magi come after the child's born, and it doesn't have to say, and it was this many days after the child was born. And we can kind of learn some things too if we get far enough. So you notice, they're coming into the house. Where do you think that house was? Nazareth, right? Seems like that star should probably be called the Star of Nazareth. Be careful. Hey, I understand. People make these statements. They just haven't looked into things. Don't get upset with people. Just notice what's here. After coming into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother. And they fell to the ground and worshiped him. Did they do exactly what they had wanted to do? They came all this way, and what God had revealed to them in looking up to the celestial bodies is true. And you realize, what do you think they did with that story? I've often wondered if you went back and looked through the Oriental histories, if there's ever any footnotes on people coming back with a story like this. I wonder if it's there or not. I don't know. I know it happened, but did anybody write it down, and did the Lord see to preserve it? He says, you notice they saw the child with Mary his mother. They fell to the ground and worshiped him. Then opening their treasures, they presented to him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And notice, what does worship entail to them? What do they now want to offer? They want to offer a gift of worship, don't they? And you think through here of going, they pull out gold, and people usually make these ties, and I think they're okay. It doesn't say this specifically. Think about gold being about king, because they knew they're coming to worship the king of the Jews. Frankincense, which is, in the Old Testament, frankincense is about prayer. Prayer being offered up to God, a soothing aroma, a sweet smell. Then it brings up myrrh. Now this is the one that's a little odd in one sense, but not in another. Myrrh was something that what's going to happen with Jesus later? What's he going to be anointed with after his death? Yeah, about burial. Think about it, they use aloes and myrrh. Someone gave me, not too long ago, now this is soap, but it's fragrance with myrrh and frankincense. It's a very clean smell, and you can smell it if you like after class. But to understand, here it was, this to be offered to this child, and you don't know what age. I mean, are we talking he's 2 months old? Are we talking about he's 12 months old? We know what's going to come next in terms of looking at who he's going to try to kill. Here it is. They're going to be everyone who's 2 years of age and younger, which kind of gives you a little bit of a mindset of it's probably not even a few weeks after Jesus is born. This is probably a little bit of time has passed. But that's just speculation on that part. Verse 12. He says, and having been warned by God in a dream not to return to Herod, the Magi left for their own country by another way. This tells you a couple things in particular. These men are not from the country of Israel. They are from the east, and it is another country. Number two, God was willing to warn them not to go back to Herod. And think about what was God's motive. Who's he protecting? Jesus. And to go, even though Herod had said, you just come on back and tell me so that I come and worship. Now, I want you to think about that. If God says, nope, don't tell Herod. It's okay if Herod doesn't worship this child. In one sense of going, because he's not going to anyway. That's not really his purpose. And so, in whatever way God sends, they have this dream, and in the dream they're warned by God. He says, don't go to Herod, go back home. And so sure enough, these wise men did. And once again, like what Karen brought out, you realize this doesn't take place in Bethlehem. And by the way, just because there's 3 gifts doesn't mean there's 3 wise men. So be careful with that one too. People just always make that assumption for whatever reason. Then, verse 13. He says, now when they had gone, so the Magi have already left. Behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him. So the Magi have left. They've gone back to their own country. And then God sends, he says, the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Now, Joseph's had an experience like this before, right? Where the Lord tells him, hey, don't send her away. He says, she is a child, and it's for me. And to go, and she's going to give birth, and you're going to name him Jesus. He's going to be a son. And realize, at this point in time, you can understand Joseph, whenever he got the message at the end of chapter 1, that would take a little bit more faith to trust and to go, okay, I don't want to send her away publicly. I don't want to disgrace her. And then he gets this message. Whenever he was just thinking about that, God sends the message to him. And he had to go, okay, that's what I'll do. I mean, a virgin giving birth, this has never been heard of before until all of a sudden, whether he heard it or whether he learned it later or whatever in Isaiah 7, of going, all right, everything has happened just the way God told him. And that was things that was good and protective for Jesus. Now to get this message, I want you to kind of notice he gets this message in a dream from the angel of the Lord. He says, get up, take the child and his mother, flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you. You stay there until I tell you to come back. Well, he's already heard from God twice, so he has no doubt that he'd hear from him again. And there is a pretty big Jewish constituency down there in Egypt, by the way, at this point in time. He says, remain there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him. Oh, this is why the Magi didn't go back to Herod. Oh, Herod wants to destroy him? We can't go there. And to realize, too, Nazareth is up in northern Palestine, so they've got to go down. It's actually called the Via Maris, and we'll get to that hopefully next week. A road that travels is a trade route that goes, it's called the Via Maris because Maris is the word for sea. And so it kind of follows the coastline, not right on the coast, but to follow down through to be able to get from the north all the way down to Egypt. And you don't even have to come close to Jerusalem. It's as if God had already prepared a way. I mean, I hope you see these kind of things and don't just think that God only does this for his son. I hope you can look back in life sometimes and go, I see how God prepared me for this moment because of these experiences, because of what he had laid out and what he had desired. And to go, I mean, I'm not saying he comes to us in dreams. Those things are long gone. Hebrews 1 talks about God doesn't talk to us in these other ways anymore. He talks to us in his son. And that's Hebrews 1:1 and 2. And to go, it's not that we're looking for that kind of thing. We're going, look, his word's going to give us the direction of what we need to do. Then, if you notice at verse 14, I want you to see how immediate Joseph takes this threat. He says, so Joseph got up and took the child and his mother while it was still night and left for Egypt. He didn't say, let's wait till daylight. I mean, just to imagine the response to God it takes in faith to get this dream at night and before the sun comes up. I mean, it's not like you said, okay, let's get prepared tonight because I'm going to have this dream and we all have everything packed up and ready to go. I mean, before the sun comes up, they're already on the road down to Egypt. And do you appreciate that God didn't tell them, here's where specifically I want you to go in Egypt? He just says, you just get down to Egypt, that's good enough. You don't have to be in one specific place. And you realize there is a big constituency in Alexandria at the time of Jews. But it doesn't ever say exactly where he goes in Egypt. But you know one thing for certain. Joseph took it serious. And whenever he said, don't tell Herod because Herod wants to destroy this child, it's not as if Joseph knew, oh, this is what would happen later on if we stayed here. You can tell in Joseph's mind, this was an imminent threat. And the longer we wait, the more likely we are that this child is not going to live. And you think there's protection of going, you see the seriousness that Joseph looks at this with, which tells you something about his heart. And it also should tell us something about where our heart should be whenever we read through the Word of God and we see something that we need to change, something that needs to take a different direction, maybe something in our lives that no longer should be part of us, and going, that's not something to wait till later. That's something to address right now. Now that I've read it in God's Word, now that I've seen it, I need to change it now, not later. And so you see exactly how Joseph takes this message from God through the angel of the Lord. Then verse 15. He remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Out of Egypt I called my son. And notice, he was told specifically that Herod was the one that was the threat. And if you notice, they stay until the death of Herod. Now, he's going to get a message here down the road, so don't think that he went, oh, Herod's dead, so we can go back, even though I haven't heard from God. Matthew's just telling you the account. Here's how long it takes. There's going to be a trigger that sends them back. But he says he's there till the death of Herod, and once again, if you look at the chronology of history, Herod dies on the scale that they use about 4 BC, which, once again, if you're looking at their scale and putting all your trust in it, you go, he dies before Jesus is even born? How can this whole story be even true? Well, the Scripture's right. Man has a hard time piecing things together. And if you find somebody who's really accurate, they'll move that scale a few years. but it throws everything off, so they just leave it the way it is. It's kind of like there's some things that are broken, but you don't replace them just yet. They know what that's like too. So he says, the Lord, through the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. And there are actually 3 or 4 different places we need to look at this, and so we'll start there next week. But before we end, I want to show you Hosea 11, because that's the direct quotation. Old Testament minor prophet. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah. Hosea chapter 11. Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea. Hosea chapter 11. And if you remember what the book of Hosea is about, a prophet by the name of Hosea who God instructs to go marry a harlot. And he says, so that you'll know what it's like to love Israel and Judah, because they are so, they want to go away from me at every turn. And notice Hosea chapter 11. Look at verse 1. He says, when Israel was a youth, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. Now, I want you to think about the parallels that are here. When Hosea is talking about this, when Israel was a youth, I loved him. Where was Israel whenever God called them out of Egypt? We know they were in Egypt. What did God use to deliver them? Remember the 10 plagues that God sent upon Egypt? Way long ago. This is whenever Moses was leading God's people out of Egypt. He says, when Israel was a youth, I loved him. And it's interesting that Israel's talked about as a male at this point. He says, and out of Egypt I called my son. And if you remember, what's the 10th plague? Death of the firstborn, right? So, you see some parallels. Here is a son that if he stayed in Nazareth would have been what? Destroyed, killed. That's what God, through the angel of the Lord, told Joseph. He says, and out of Egypt I called my son. And as I brought Israel out of Egypt to the promised land, where's he going to bring Jesus out of? Out of Egypt. To bring him to show Israel salvation and to talk about the true promised land. Not just a physical land, but a spiritual land to dwell in forever. Eternal. Now, you see the prophecy here, and as it keeps on going, there's some other things that tie it together. Look at verse 2. The more they called them, the more they went from them. You realize God's people, they got into the wilderness. Did it get better or worse? It got worse for them, but they were men of faith, and I'm sure women too, Joshua and Caleb being 2 of them. He says, the more they went from them, they kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning incense to idols. Yet it is I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them in my arms. And you realize, you think about age. What age do you teach your children to walk? Yeah, somewhere around there, plus or minus. Sometimes a little bit younger, sometimes a little older. He says, I took them in my arms, and they did not know that I healed them. Verse 4, I led them with cords of a man, with bonds of love. I mean, just think about the imagery there with Jesus. Bonds of love. Think about, here he is when he's crucified. I mean, it's not the nails that hold him. I mean, it's his love of doing God's will. And then he says, and I became to them as one who lifts the yoke from their jaws. I bent down and fed them. Think about, isn't that what Jesus came to destroy? He says, I came to take you out of the yoke of the law so that I could give you my yoke, that you could learn from me. And I hope you're thinking about Matthew 11, where Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, I'll give you rest. He says, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. He says, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm meek and lowly in heart. And you go, I want there to be a yoke where you're in the yoke together with me and you can learn from me because I'm right beside you. Think about, how's that different? That's a lot different than where they were under the law. It's a lot different than the way they were back in Egypt. So you see just more and more of these parallels as they come through. And Lord willing, next week when we come back together, we'll look at some more of these as they tie together. All right, any questions? Yes?
Weren't they going to pay their taxes when they left? I mean, I don't know where I got that. Maybe I just
There was a tax they should have been paying in Israel if there was a census from the Old Testament. But let's look at Luke 2 real quick. It'll tell us. she had asked whenever they went down to the census, was it to pay taxes? And if you look through Luke 2, 1 through 5, it doesn't bring up anything about a tax there. It just talks about registering for the census. So I'm going to say no.